When I first bought my house in the Clearbrook subdivision, I thought I was making a smart investment. It was a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where kids rode bikes on sidewalks and people waved at each other from driveways. Promised we'll maintain common areas, responsive community leadership, and a spirit of neighborly cooperation. What I got instead was Joyce Whitaker. Joyce was the HOA president, a woman whose entire personality seemed to be made of laminated bylaws and passive-aggressive emails. She didn't run the HOA so much as she ruled it. It's like a petty monarch whose crown was a sun visor and whose scepter was a clipboard. From the moment I moved in, Joyce made it clear she considered me a potential problem. I got my first violation. Notice the day after I unpacked the last moving box. Trash cans must be stored out of view by 9 a.m. the day after pickup. It read. Mine had been at the curb until 9:04. It didn't stop there. My mailbox was the wrong shade of black. My grass was a 1/4 inch too long. The solar lights along my walkway were non-uniform in appearance. Each infraction came with a fine and a threat to escalate. At first, I tried to comply. I repainted the mailbox. I trimmed the lawn obsessively. I replaced the solar lights with a matching set, but no matter what I did, Joyce found something else to criticize. It felt less like she was enforcing standards and more like she was trying to assert dominance. Then came the waterline rerouting project. The HOA had contracted a company called Civic Flow Solutions to modernize the neighborhood's water infrastructure. What that actually meant was tearing up everyone's yards without warning, breaking sprinkler systems and leaving trenches half covered with plywood. My front lawn looked like a battlefield. When I complained, Joyce said the HOA had full authority to approve infrastructure projects and that any damage would be addressed in due course. Weeks passed. The holes remained. I started digging into Civic Flow Solutions. The company had a slick website and listed a local address, but the office was just a P.O. box. The business license had been filed only 6 months earlier. No online reviews, no client testimonials, no project history. Something didn't add up. Then I noticed the last name of the registered agent, Whitaker, Joyce's nephew. As it turned out, that was the moment I stopped trying to get along and started paying attention. I began attending HOA meetings regularly, taking notes, asking questions about budgets and vendor contracts. Joyce didn't like that. She tried to shut me down with procedural objections and time limits, but I kept showing up. I submitted records requests. I connected with other homeowners who were frustrated but afraid to speak out. The more I uncovered, the more obvious it became that Civic Flow Solutions was a shell company funneling HOA funds to Joyce's family. At one meeting, I asked for a copy of the contract with Civic Flow. Joyce said it was proprietary and not subject to homeowner review. That was a lie. HOAs are required by state law to make vendor contracts available to members upon request. I filed a formal complaint with the state's HOA Oversight Board. Response was slow, but it lit a fuse. Around that time, I met Rachel, a civil engineer who had recently moved into the neighborhood. She'd had her own run-ins with Joyce over a minor fence repair. When I told her about the waterline project, her eyes narrowed. None of that work was up to code, she said. They're using PVC rated for indoor use. It's going to crack in the first freeze. Rachel helped me document the violations, took photos, compared materials, and reviewed permit applications. Rather, the lack thereof. Civic Flow hadn't filed any permits with the city for the work they were doing. That meant every trench, every pipe, every rerouted line was an uninspected, unauthorized liability. Then I got the idea. If Joyce could use her position to benefit her family financially, maybe I could use mine to expose her. Public utilities for 20 years before retiring early. I understood infrastructure. I understood regulations. I understood how to acquire things. I approached the owner of Clearbrook Water. It's the private company that serviced our subdivision. It was a small operation, just under 1,000 customers, mostly residential. The owner was in his 70s and looking to retire. After a few conversations and some due diligence, I made an offer. Within 6 weeks, I owned the water company. That was when things started to shift. The first thing I did was audit every customer connection in the subdivision. Any line that had been modified without proper permits or engineering oversight was flagged for review. I sent out letters informing residents that non-compliant systems would need to be brought up to code or face service suspension. I expected pushback, but most people understood. They'd seen the shoddy work Civic Flow had done. They were all ready. Worried about leaks and pressure drops, Joyce, on the other hand, was furious. She showed up at my house unannounced, lips pressed so tight they looked stapled together. "You can't use your position to punish the community," she snapped. I replied calmly, "I'm not. I'm using my position to enforce safety standards. Something the HOA should have done in the first place." She tried to rally the community against me. She printed flyers claiming I was creating a monopoly, raising rates, threatening service interruptions to force people into costly repairs. Some folks believed her for a while, but I countered with facts, detailed inspection reports, photographs, engineering analyses. And eventually, a report titled Infrastructure Safety and Financial Transparency, a community assessment, hand-delivered copies to every home. It included payment records showing the HOA's financial relationship with Civic Flow Solutions, photos of substandard materials, and a comparison of market rates versus what the HOA had paid Joyce's nephew. The numbers spoke for themselves. The tide turned. Neighbors who had once been skeptical started asking questions at meetings. Gary O'Connell, a longtime resident and former accountant, took a particular interest. He reviewed the documents and began organizing a petition for a formal audit of the HOA's finances. Within a week, they had more than enough signatures to trigger a vote. Joyce tried to discredit me publicly, accusing me of waging a personal vendetta. But every time she spoke, I responded with documents, not arguments, not accusations, just facts. And when the audit results came in, they confirmed everything. Over $150,000 paid to Civic Flow Solutions for unpermitted, substandard work. No competitive bidding, no oversight, no justification. A special election was scheduled to remove Joyce from office. I didn't campaign, I didn't knock on doors, just kept doing the work, fixing pipes, updating service records, and ensuring everyone had access to safe, reliable water. Joyce lost in a landslide. But I wasn't done. They all have opinions about how you should do your job, but Sterling also seemed excited about the modernization plans Rachel and I had outlined. Sterling agreed to stay on as a consultant for the first year to help with the transition. As we shook hands, I felt like I was finally in a position to ensure nobody would ever have to live without water, because someone else decided they didn't deserve it, of course. Joyce found out about the acquisition within days of the paperwork being finalized. I was working in my yard, finally repairing the damage from the waterline rerouting project, when Joyce appeared at my fence line, face twisted like she'd sniffed sabotage buried under her roses. "Clayton, I understand you've purchased Clearbrook Water. I hope you realize that this creates a significant conflict of interest regarding your participation in community infrastructure decisions." Her voice had that tight quality people get when they're trying very hard not to reveal that their entire scam has just been compromised. I looked up from planting new flowers in the space where her construction crew had torn up my landscaping. "Joyce, I think you misunderstand the nature of conflict of interest. A conflict exists when someone uses their position to benefit themselves at the expense of others, like authorizing payments to companies owned by family members." Her face cycled through several different expressions as she processed what I just said. I could see the wheels turning in her head as she realized that her nephew's fake company was about to become a very real problem. That evening, I sent a formal letter to every resident in the subdivision. The letter introduced me as the new owner of Clearbrook Water and outlined my plans for improving service reliability and customer communication. But the real purpose was to announce that Clearbrook would be conducting a comprehensive review of all existing infrastructure to ensure compliance with current safety and efficiency standards. Any water lines that had been modified without proper permits or engineering oversight would need to be brought up to code within 60 days, or service would be temporarily suspended until corrections could be made. I was no longer just another homeowner dealing with HOA nonsense. I was the person who controlled whether the water flowed or stopped. Joyce's response arrived the next morning in the form of an angry phone call that woke me up at 6:30. Clayton, this is completely unacceptable. You cannot use your position as a utility owner to retaliate against legitimate community improvement projects. I let her vent for about 2 minutes before calmly explaining that safety inspections and code compliance weren't retaliation. They were standard business practices that Clearbrook had neglected under previous ownership. Joyce, if the infrastructure modifications in our subdivision were done properly, with appropriate permits and engineering oversight, then the inspection will confirm that everything is up to standard. But if shortcuts were taken or proper procedures weren't followed, then we have a responsibility to address those issues before they become a safety problem. The beautiful thing about owning the water company was that everything I was doing was not only legal, but actually required by state regulations. Joyce had taught me an important lesson about the power of controlling essential services. I was just going to apply that lesson in ways she never anticipated. I thought I had Joyce cornered. The evidence of her embezzlement scheme was solid. The Clearbrook acquisition gave me legitimate authority to review all the infrastructure modifications, and the community was starting to ask questions about the HOA's financial management. What I didn't anticipate was Joyce's talent for manipulating public opinion and her willingness to throw me under the bus to save herself. While I was focused on building a case based on facts and documentation, Joyce was busy crafting a narrative that would turn the entire community against me. I'd always believed community was something you could rely on, but apparently, all it takes is one pretty flyer to make people ready to burn you along with your water pipes. The first sign of trouble came when Gary O'Connell stopped by my house with a concerned expression and a stack of flyers that had been distributed to every mailbox in the subdivision. The flyers were professionally designed and featured alarming headlines like, "Corporate Takeover Threatens Community Water Supply, Local Resident Becomes Monopoly Owner." But the most absurd touch was a scale model titled "Privatized. Water Systems at Risk," decorated with miniature flags and dramatic arrows like a high school political science fair gone rogue. "Clayton," Gary said, "I don't believe this stuff, Ma, but a lot of people are starting to worry." Joyce had been going door to door telling everyone that I was planning to charge premium rates and that Clearbrook's previous owner was pressured into selling. The flyers were a masterpiece of selective information and emotional manipulation. They mentioned my conflict of interest as both a resident and utility owner, but ignored the fact that Joyce had been funneling community funds too. Her nephew's company, they raised concerns about corporate control of essential services, but failed to mention that I was a local resident with 20 years of experience in water systems management. Most damaging of all, they included quotes from concerned residents expressing fear about water quality and service reliability under new ownership. The whole situation felt surreal. I'd never been cast as the villain before, but it turned out it was like sitting in the middle of a Shark Tank, where everyone was wearing polo shirts and holding calculators. Joyce's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. She was using legitimate concerns about utility privatization to distract from her own misconduct. By framing me as a corporate raider rather than a neighbor trying to improve community services, she was tapping into people's general anxiety about losing control over essential services. Within a week of the flyers being distributed, I started noticing changes in how neighbors interacted with me. Friendly waves became polite nods. Casual conversations became awkward. Exchanges about property values and service concerns. People I'd helped unclog drains were now looking at me like I'd rerouted their trust straight into a cesspool. The situation reached its peak during an emergency HOA meeting that Joyce called to address community concerns about utility ownership. The meeting was packed as twice the attendance of any previous meeting I had witnessed, and the air was thick with tension. Joyce stood at the front of the room with her propaganda diorama prominently displayed, pointing to various miniature buildings as she explained how private utility ownership was supposedly connected to international conspiracies. For the next hour, I watched Joyce conduct a masterclass in deflection and misdirection. Every time someone asked about HOA finances or vendor relationships, she steered the conversation back to concerns about utility privatization and corporate accountability. The faces of neighbors who'd once trusted me were now filled with suspicion and fear. And I realized that Joyce had successfully transformed a discussion about her own financial misconduct into a referendum on my character. I didn't argue back. I just took notes on every word they said, because next time I wouldn't need to. Speak it all, the documents would do the talking for me. I'd just been tossed in a political blender on high speed, where facts were pulp and truth barely made it to the cup. Joyce had successfully transformed a discussion about HOA financial irregularities into a referendum on my character and business practices. Residents who had previously supported me were now expressing doubts, and people who had never shown any interest in community affairs were suddenly passionate advocates for public utility ownership. I left that meeting feeling defeated and questioning whether I'd made a terrible mistake. The real cost was the damage to my reputation in the community and the realization that Joyce was a much more formidable opponent than I'd anticipated. That night, I sat in my kitchen staring at the clear brook, water business documents spread across my table, and wondering if I should just cut my losses. But as I reviewed the evidence Rachel and I had compiled about Civic Flow Solutions and Joyce's embezzlement scheme, I remembered something important. The truth doesn't change just because someone tells a more compelling lie. Joyce might have won this round, but the facts were still on my side as I sat there in the darkness. Feeling the weight of my neighbor's betrayal, I realized that Joyce had made one crucial mistake. She'd shown me exactly how much power came from controlling the narrative. And more importantly, she'd shown me what happened when someone underestimated the determination of a person who'd spent his entire career ensuring that water flows where it's supposed to flow. The morning after Joyce's propaganda victory at the community meeting, I woke up with a new perspective on the situation. Instead of feeling defeated, I felt liberated. Joyce had shown her hand by launching a public attack on my character and business practices, which meant she was feeling threatened enough to take serious risks. More importantly, she'd made the classic mistake of assuming that owning the narrative was the same as controlling the facts. As someone who'd spent 20 years solving complex infrastructure problems, I knew that the most elegant solutions often involved using your opponent's own momentum against them. Joyce had mastered the illusion of control, but I held the valves in tomorrow. Everyone would feel the pressure shift. My first step was to implement exactly the kind of professional utility management practices that Joyce had claimed to be worried about. I sent formal notifications to every Clearbrook customer explaining that the company was conducting a comprehensive infrastructure audit to ensure compliance with state safety regulations and service quality standards. The notifications were professionally formatted, clearly written, and included detailed explanations of why such audits were necessary for maintaining reliable service. Made sure to emphasize that this was standard practice for responsible utility. Companies and that customers would be notified in advance of any work that might affect their service. This wasn't about revenge or retaliation. It was about doing the job Joyce had pretended her nephew's company was already doing. The infrastructure audit revealed exactly what I'd expected, but the scope was worse than even I had imagined. 34 safety red flags, 16 slow leaks ticking like silent clocks, 6 neighborhoods patched together with excuses and expired permits. The rerouting of my own water line was just one example of work that looked acceptable on the surface, but failed to meet professional standards for pressure management, leak prevention, and long-term reliability. I documented everything with photographs, engineering assessments, and detailed reports that clearly explained why each violation posed potential risks to service quality and customer safety. Every single modification that Joyce's approved vendors had completed was either substandard, incomplete, or outright dangerous. But the real revelation came when Rachel and I analyzed the payment records between the HOA and Civic Flow Solutions in conjunction with the timeline of infrastructure modifications. The pattern was unmistakable. Every time the HOA authorized a payment to Civic Flow Solutions for infrastructure construction, it was followed within weeks by some kind of construction project that required follow-up payments for implementation. Oversight and compliance verification. The total amount of money involved was staggering. Over the past 3 years, the HOA had paid Civic Flow Solutions more than $150,000 for services. It appeared to consist primarily of authorizing substandard construction work. I compiled all of this information into a comprehensive report that I distributed to every resident in the subdivision. I delivered the report, no commentary, no cover-up, just $signs, busted valves, and Joyce's nephew's signature sealing every page. The report was titled Infrastructure Safety and Financial Transparency, a Community Assessment. It laid out the facts in clear, objective language that anyone could understand. I included photographs of code violations, copies of payment records showing the HOA's relationship with Civic Flow Solutions, detailed explanations of why proper infrastructure management required professional oversight and regulatory compliance. Most importantly, I included a comparison showing how much money the community could have saved by working directly with licensed contractors instead of paying inflated fees to Joyce's nephew's shell company. 1 hour after the report was distributed, Gary knocked on my door. 3 other residents called. 20 signatures demanding a financial audit were collected that same evening. The reaction was swift and decisive, in a way that Joyce's propaganda campaign had never achieved. When people saw actual evidence, instead of emotional manipulation, they understood immediately what had been happening to their community funds. The photos of improperly installed pipes and inflated invoices spoke louder than any political rhetoric Joyce could manufacture. Joyce's response was swift and predictable. She called another emergency HOA meeting to address what she characterized as personal attacks and corporate intimidation tactics. But this time, the dynamics were different. Gary O'Connell had spent the past week reviewing the financial documents I'd provided, and he'd come to his own conclusions about the Civic Flow Solutions, its payments. When Joyce tried to dismiss my report as biased and self-serving, Gary stood up and asked pointed questions about vendor selection procedures and financial oversight. The room fell silent as residents realized that Gary wasn't just asking rhetorical questions, he was demanding answers. Joyce couldn't provide. The meeting that followed was unlike anything I'd witnessed in community association politics. Gary's questions opened the floodgates for other residents who been quietly harboring doubts about the HOA's financial management. People started asking about other vendor relationships, questioning why certain projects had cost so much more than similar work in neighboring subdivisions, demanding explanations for the lack of documentation supporting major expenditures. Joyce tried to maintain control by invoking procedural rules and administrative authority, but her credibility had been fatally damaged by the evidence in my report. Joyce scrambled to plug leaks in a ship already halfway under. This time, the crowd stayed dry and watched her drown in procedure. The turning point came when someone asked Joyce to explain why Civic Flow Solutions had been paid for consulting on projects that were later found to be non-compliant with safety regulations. Instead of providing a direct answer, Joyce attempted to shift blame to Clearbrook Water's previous management and suggested that current safety concerns were being manufactured to justify higher utility rates. But Gary had done his homework. He immediately pointed out that the safety violations predated my acquisition of Clearbrook by several years. I didn't need to win the argument. At invoices, regulations, and leaking pipes still spraying water at house number 12. By the end of that meeting, Joyce's position as HOA president was essentially untenable. Formal petition was circulated calling for her immediate resignation and a full audit of the association's finances. The petition gained more than enough signatures to trigger a special election, and Joyce's support among residents had evaporated once the facts about her nephew's company became public knowledge, but I wasn't satisfied with simply exposing. I wanted to make sure she experienced the full consequences of her actions, and I had the perfect tool at my disposal. The legitimate authority that comes with owning a utility company. As the new owner of Clearbrook Water, I had both the right and the responsibility to ensure that all customer connections met current safety and regulatory standards. This meant that any infrastructure modifications that had been done without proper permits or engineering oversight would need to be corrected. Before service could continue, I sent formal notifications to every customer whose property had been affected by the substandard work, explaining that they would need to bring their connections up to code within 30 days or face temporary service suspension. The cost of these corrections would be substantial, exactly 3 times the normal rate for emergency compliance work, which was standard industry practice for addressing safety violations under compressed timelines. As water pressure, whoever messed up bears the force. It was actuarial. As customers with properly maintained code-compliant connections represented lower risk, so they paid lower rates. Gary called me around 9 o'clock that evening with the election results. Joyce had been removed from office by a margin of more than 4-1, with even some of her former supporters voting against her once the full extent of her financial misconduct became public. The new HOA board would be headed by Gary himself, along with 2 other residents who'd been vocal advocates for financial transparency and proper oversight. Clayton, Gary said, "I want you to know that the new board intends to pursue full restitution from Joyce and her nephew for the money that was improperly paid to Civic Flow Solutions. We're also implementing new procurement procedures too. Make sure this kind of thing never happens again." The following Monday, I sent out the new water bills reflecting the updated rate structure. For most customers, the bills were actually lower than they'd been under Clearbrook's previous ownership, thanks to operational improvements and the elimination of several unnecessary administrative fees. But for the handful of properties that had been affected by Joyce's infrastructure modifications, the bills were substantially higher. Joyce's own monthly water bill went from $87 to $261, reflecting the triple rate for non-compliant connections, plus additional fees for emergency compliance processing. I made sure to include a detailed explanation of the rate structure and the specific safety violations that had triggered the premium pricing. Joyce called within hours, voice shrill enough to crack pipes. I let her vent, then calmly explained, "This isn't revenge. It's regulation with consequences. Joyce, these aren't discriminatory rates. They're risk-adjusted rates based on the additional costs associated with maintaining service to non-compliant infrastructure. If you'd like to return to standard rates, you're welcome to hire a licensed contractor to bring your water connection up to current safety codes." The conversation was exactly as satisfying as I'd hoped, not because I was hurting Joyce, but because I was finally applying the same professional standards to her that she should have been following all along. The beauty of the situation was that everything I was doing was not only legal, but actually required by industry regulations and sound business practices. Utility companies are obligated to charge rates that reflect the true cost of providing service, including the additional expenses associated with maintaining aging or substandard infrastructure. The fact that Joyce's own actions had created the conditions that justified higher rates was simply poetic justice. She'd spent months manipulating community resources for personal gain. Now she was experiencing the direct financial consequences of her misconduct. Unlike her nephew's fake company, Clearbrook Water under my ownership was providing actual value for every dollar charged. Over the following weeks, most of the affected customers chose to upgrade their water connections to meet current standards rather than continue paying premium rates. The work was done by licensed contractors who pulled proper permits and followed established engineering practices, exactly the kind of professional approach that Joyce had circumvented with her Civic Flow Solutions scheme. 3 months' worth of bills over, $800 down the drain. Then came the contractors, digging with shovels, not machines, so she could feel every strike echo through her rosebed. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that bringing these connections up to code cost roughly the same amount of money that had been paid to Joyce's nephew's company, except this time, the community actually received value for their investment. Joyce herself held out for several months, apparently hoping that public pressure would force me to reverse the rate structure or that some kind of legal challenge would invalidate the new billing system. But when her quarterly water bill exceeded $700, She finally capitulated and hired contractors to fix her. Connection, the work revealed exactly what I'd expected. The original rerouting had been done with substandard materials, improper fittings, and no consideration for long-term maintenance. Requirements: bringing everything up to code required completely redoing the installation, which cost Joyce more than $3,000 out of her own pocket. The final chapter of this story came when the state Attorney General's office announced that they were investigating the financial relationships between several HOAs and vendors that appeared to be shell companies. Joyce and her nephew were among the first people charged in what became a much larger investigation into public corruption and embezzlement. After Joyce, at least 3 other HOAs were dragged into the investigation. I wasn't the only one who opened the floodgates of truth. Joyce ultimately pled guilty to appropriation of community funds and was sentenced to restitution payments in community service. Her nephew's company was dissolved, and he was banned from conducting business with any homeowner association in the state. As for me, I settled into my new role as a utility company owner with a deep appreciation for the power of patience, preparation, and professional standards. Clearbrook Water became a model for community utility management with transparent pricing, proactive maintenance, and the kind of customer service that treats water as an essential resource rather than a profit center. My own water connection was restored to full functionality within a week of Joyce's removal from office, and my yard eventually recovered from the damage caused by her infrastructure improvement project. Don't need to be elected neighborhood mayor. I just want every time someone turns on their faucet, they know they're being respected. Looking back on the whole experience, I'm struck by how simple the solution turned out to be once I stopped trying to fight Joyce on her terms. Started using my own expertise and resources. Sometimes the best way to deal with someone who abuses power is to demonstrate what responsible power actually looks like. Thought she could control the community by manipulating rules and procedures, but she forgot that real control comes from understanding systems and serving people's actual needs. Joyce played HOHS. I rerouted the whole board and let gravity handle the rest. If you've ever dealt with someone who thought they could push you around because they had a little bit of authority, tell me about it in the comments. I'd love to hear how you handled your own power-hungry bureaucrat QA story. Signing off for now. But the drama? Oh, it never sleeps. Tap that bell if you're ready for round 2. So what did I learn from all of this? I learned that water pressure doesn't just apply to pipes. It applies to people, especially when you're willing to hold them accountable using the very rules they tried to twist in their favor. Joyce underestimated me. She thought I was just another neighbor with a grudge, a man who'd be satisfied with getting his landscaping fixed and maybe a public apology. But what I really wanted was change. Not just in my yard or on my bill, but in the culture of how power was used in our neighborhood. I didn't need a title or a seat on the board. I just needed leverage in the law, the documents, the engineering, the compliance codes. They gave me that. They gave me enough to dismantle every lie Joyce built brick by brick, pipe by pipe, because when you control the valves, you don't argue with the people twisting the truth. You turn the pressure up and let the system speak for itself. In Clearbrook Water, it didn't just become a utility, it became a symbol. A reminder that sometimes the people who fix the problems aren't the ones with loud voices, they're the ones with quiet plans, numbers, and unshakable patience. The neighborhood changed after Joyce was gone. People stopped whispering during HOA meetings and started asking real questions. They started showing up, reading the budget reports, participating in maintenance walkthroughs. Transparency wasn't just a word, it was practice. Gary and the new board backed it up. They launched a community transparency portal publicly, posted contracts, and even invited residents to bid for work directly, removing middlemen like Civic Flow Solutions. And every quarter, they sent out reports from Clearbrook Water. Clear, concise, professionally reviewed. People started to trust the system again, not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. One of the most satisfying moments Seeing Joyce drive by the community center slowed down, sunglasses on, barely looking up. The place where she, once ruled with passive-aggressive flyers and procedural dominance, was now a place she no longer belonged. No more backdoor deals, no more unchecked power, just water, flowing clean and quiet like it was supposed to. My favorite part? Knowing that no matter how much she twisted narratives or played victim, the math would always betray her. The invoices, the missing permits, the unsafe connections, they were real. And unlike gossip, real things leave a trail. There's a kind of poetic justice in letting infrastructure speak for itself. Joyce spun stories. I had spreadsheets, and when it comes to who the community believed in the end, well, let's just say, valves don't lie. So if you're out there dealing with your own HOA nightmare, or a corrupt committee, or someone who thinks rules only apply to others, remember this. Sometimes you don't have to yell, you don't have to beg, you don't even have to fight them in their arena sometimes. You just buy the water company, and that's how you win. QA story. Signing off until the next time someone picks the wrong neighbor to underestimate.